In the shadows of the grand Willow's Higher Palace, where centuries of royal tradition cast long shadows over marble corridors, a single moment was about to shatter everything the kingdom believed about their beloved royal family. What started as a routine security check would uncover a truth so devastating that it would force Crown Prince Alexander to choose between his brother's life and the survival of the monarchy itself. Some secrets are buried so deep that when they surface, they don't just destroy lives, they topple kingdoms. The autumn rain drummed steadily against the towering windows of Willow's Higher Palace as Crown Prince Alexander stood in the Grand Library, his fingers tracing the leather spines of ancient law books. The weight of his future crown seemed heavier today, pressing down on his shoulders like the oppressive gray clouds that had settled over the kingdom for the past week. At 28, Alexander had spent his entire life preparing for the throne, but nothing had prepared him for the conversation he'd had with his mother, Queen Isabella, just hours earlier. "The people are growing restless, Alexander," she had said, her voice carrying the burden of 40 years of royal duty. "The economic troubles, the scandals in Parliament, the whispers about our family's relevance in modern times. We must be beyond reproach now more than ever." Alexander's younger brother, Prince Marcus, had always been the wild card in their carefully orchestrated royal existence. Where Alexander was measured and diplomatic, Marcus was spontaneous and rebellious. Where Alexander studied constitutional law and international relations, Marcus spent his time with artists, musicians, and what their father diplomatically called unconventional companions. The sound of gravel crunching under tires drew Alexander's attention to the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, he watched as Marcus's sleek black sports car pulled up to the palace's private entrance. Even from this distance, Alexander could see the tension in his brother's movements as he stepped out of the vehicle, his usual confident swagger replaced by something that looked suspiciously like nervousness. Marcus was supposed to be attending a charity gala in the capital city, representing the royal family at an event supporting children's hospitals. Instead, he had returned to the palace 3 hours early, and Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The palace's head of security, Commander William Rhodes, emerged from the shadows of the entrance portico. Rhodes was a man who had served the royal family for over 2 decades, his loyalty absolute, and his methods thorough. He approached Marcus's car with the practiced eye of someone who had seen enough in his years of service to trust nothing and question everything. "Your Highness," Rhodes called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard despite the rain. "I'll need to conduct the standard security inspection of your vehicle." Alexander watched as Marcus's face went pale. In all their years growing up in the palace, with its constant security protocols and endless inspections, Alexander had never seen his brother react with such obvious distress to a routine procedure. Marcus's hands were visibly shaking as he handed over his keys, and he kept glancing toward the palace windows as if searching for an escape route. "Of course, Commander," Marcus replied, his voice strained. "Though I'm rather tired from the evening. Perhaps we could expedite things." Rhodes had served the royal family long enough to recognize when something was amiss. He had seen Prince Marcus return from countless events, often in various states of intoxication or exhaustion, but never with this particular combination of fear and desperation. The security chief's instincts, honed by years of protecting the monarchy from threats both external and internal, began to sound alarm bells. As Rhodes approached the rear of the sports car, Marcus stepped forward as if to intervene. "Commander, really, there's nothing of concern. Just some gifts from the charity organizers, and perhaps a bottle or 2 of wine from the reception." The explanation was too detailed, too rushed, and too defensive for Rhodes's liking. In his experience, innocent people didn't feel the need to explain themselves before being asked. His weathered hands gripped the trunk release, and he could see Marcus visibly tense as the mechanism clicked open. Alexander felt his breath catch in his throat as he watched the scene unfold below. He couldn't see into the trunk from his vantage point, but he could read his brother's body language perfectly. Marcus was terrified, and that terror was about to become the entire family's problem. Rhodes lifted the trunk lid slowly, methodically, his movements deliberate and professional. For a moment, nothing happened. The commander simply stared into the trunk, his expression unreadable. Then, almost imperceptibly, his shoulders stiffened, and he took a step back from the vehicle. The silence stretched between the two men like a taut wire. Marcus seemed to shrink into himself, his usual royal bearing crumbling under the weight of whatever Rhodes had discovered. The commander reached for the radio clipped to his uniform, but Marcus's voice stopped him. "Please," Marcus said, and the single word carried such desperation that Alexander felt his heart skip a beat. "Let me explain." Rhodes's hand hovered over his radio for what felt like an eternity. As head of palace security, his duty was clear: report any threats to the royal family immediately. But, as a man who had watched Prince Marcus grow from a mischievous child into a troubled young adult, he found himself torn between protocol and compassion. "Your Highness," Rhodes said finally, his voice carefully controlled, "I think you need to call your brother." Alexander didn't wait to hear more. He was already moving, his feet carrying him through the familiar corridors of the palace with urgent purpose. Whatever Marcus had gotten himself into this time, it was serious enough to shake Commander Rhodes, a man who had faced down assassins and terrorists without blinking. The palace staff members he passed stepped aside respectfully, but Alexander barely noticed them. His mind was racing through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. Marcus's gambling debts? A romantic scandal that could destroy their family's reputation? Evidence of illegal activities that could bring down the entire monarchy? As Alexander reached the main staircase leading to the courtyard, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in one of the ornate mirrors lining the hall. The man staring back at him looked older than his 28 years, weighed down by responsibilities he had never asked for but could never abandon. In a few hours, this moment would mark the end of his carefully controlled life and the beginning of a crisis that would test everything he believed about duty, family, and the price of wearing a crown. The heavy oak doors leading to the courtyard loomed before him, and Alexander paused with his hand on the brass handle. Whatever lay beyond those doors would change everything, and there would be no going back. The kingdom of Willow's Hire had survived wars, revolutions, and scandals, but Alexander had the terrible feeling that what awaited him in that car trunk might finally be the secret that brought down 300 years of royal tradition. He opened the door and stepped into the rain, unaware that his next decision would determine not only his brother's fate, but the future of the crown itself. The courtyard felt like a stage set for tragedy as Alexander approached the two men standing beside Marcus's car. The rain had intensified, creating a curtain of water that seemed to isolate them from the rest of the world. Each step across the wet cobblestones echoed with an ominous finality that made Alexander's chest tighten with dread. Commander Rhodes stood at attention beside the open trunk, his military bearing intact despite the obvious distress written across his weathered features. In 23 years of service to the royal family, Rhodes had maintained an unshakable composure through assassination attempts, terrorist threats, and diplomatic crises. Seeing him shaken was perhaps more terrifying than whatever secret lay hidden in the depths of Marcus's vehicle. Prince Marcus had collapsed against the side of the car, his expensive evening wear now soaked through and clinging to his trembling frame. The confident, charismatic prince who charmed crowds and graced magazine covers had vanished, replaced by a broken man who looked as if he were staring into the abyss of his own destruction. "Show me," Alexander said quietly, his voice barely audible above the drumming rain. Rhodes nodded gravely and stepped aside, allowing Alexander to approach the trunk. What he saw there would haunt him for the rest of his life, not because of its horror, but because of its implications for everything he held sacred about his family and his duty to the crown. Inside the trunk lay a collection of artifacts that told a story of betrayal spanning generations. Ancient documents bearing the royal seal were scattered among photographs, personal letters, and what appeared to be financial records dating back decades. But it was the ornate wooden box at the center of it all that drew Alexander's attention, its familiar crest making his blood run cold. The box bore the coat of arms of the neighboring kingdom of Astoria, Willowshire's oldest ally and closest friend. More troubling still, Alexander recognized the box itself. It had been a gift from King Ferdinand of Astoria to Alexander's grandfather during the peace negotiations that had ended the Continental Wars 60 years earlier. It was supposed to be on display in the palace's diplomatic wing, a symbol of the enduring friendship between their two nations. With hands that betrayed only the slightest tremor, Alexander opened the box. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay a collection of items that painted a picture of systematic espionage and betrayal. Copies of classified military documents, detailed maps of Willowshire's coastal defenses, photographs of sensitive government meetings, and, most damaging of all, a series of bank statements showing regular payments from Astorian intelligence services to an account bearing Marcus's name. "How long?" Alexander asked, his voice so quiet that Marcus had to strain to hear him over the rain. Alex, please, let me explain, Marcus began, but Alexander cut him off with a raised hand. How long, Marcus? The younger prince seemed to age 10 years in the space of a heartbeat. 3 years, he whispered. It started as something small, just information about social events, guest lists for state dinners. They said it was for diplomatic preparation, to help Astoria's representatives better engage with our allies. Alexander felt the world shift beneath his feet. 3 years. 3 years of family dinners where Marcus had sat across from him, smiling and laughing and sharing stories about his various adventures. 3 years of state functions where Marcus had stood beside him as they welcomed foreign dignitaries, including representatives from Astoria. 3 years of lies, betrayal, and treason that could destroy not only their family but the very foundation of their kingdom's security. Commander Rhodes cleared his throat diplomatically. Your Highness, protocol requires that I report this discovery immediately. The implications for national security are— I understand your position, Commander, Alexander interrupted, his mind racing through the possible consequences of this revelation. But I need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with before we proceed. Rhodes nodded reluctantly, but Alexander could see the conflict in the older man's eyes. As head of security, Rhodes had sworn an oath to protect the monarchy, but that oath now put him in the impossible position of potentially destroying it to save it. Alexander turned back to his brother, who had somehow managed to look even more defeated in the span of their brief conversation. What did you give them, Marcus? What information did you pass along? Marcus ran his hands through his rain-soaked hair, a gesture so familiar from their childhood that it made Alexander's heart ache. At first, it really was just social information. Who was attending what function, which diplomats were friendly with whom, that sort of thing. But then, they started asking for more. More what? Details about our military exercises. Information about trade negotiations with other kingdoms. Intelligence about internal political discussions. Marcus's voice broke on the last words. They said it was all for peaceful purposes, to help maintain regional stability. They convinced me I was actually helping both kingdoms by providing them with better information for diplomatic planning. Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 3 centuries of royal tradition pressing down on him like a physical force. Every king of Willow's Hire had faced moments that tested their resolve, but none had faced the prospect of their own brother's treason threatening the very existence of the monarchy. The charity gala tonight, Alexander said slowly, pieces of a terrible puzzle beginning to fall into place. You weren't at the charity gala. Marcus shook his head miserably. I was meeting with my handler. They wanted information about the new trade agreement with the northern provinces. They said it was crucial for maintaining regional economic stability. The trade agreement with the northern provinces was one of the most sensitive negotiations in recent memory. The provinces controlled vital shipping routes that were essential to Willowshire's economy, and the terms of the agreement would affect the kingdom's prosperity for generations. The fact that Astoria now possessed detailed information about those negotiations represented a betrayal of staggering proportions. Commander Rhodes stepped forward, his duty overriding his personal feelings. Your Highness, I cannot delay reporting this any longer. The security implications are too severe. If Astoria has access to our trade negotiations, they could manipulate the markets, undermine our negotiating position, or worse. Alexander knew Rhodes was right, but he also knew that the moment this became official, it would trigger a chain of events that could destroy his family and potentially destabilize the entire region. A member of the royal family committing treason against the crown was unprecedented in Willowshire's history. The constitutional crisis alone would be enough to bring down the government, and the international implications could lead to everything from economic warfare to actual military conflict. There's something else, Marcus said quietly, and the tone of his voice made Alexander's blood freeze. Something they wanted me to get for them, but I couldn't. Something that's why I was trying to end things with them tonight. Alexander felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. What did they want? Marcus looked up at his brother with eyes full of regret and terror. The security codes for the royal bunker. They wanted the emergency protocols that would be activated if the kingdom came under attack. The royal bunker was Willowshire's most closely guarded secret, an underground facility designed to protect the royal family and key government officials in the event of a catastrophic attack. The security codes Marcus referenced weren't just passwords. They were the keys to the kingdom's survival in its darkest hour. In the wrong hands, Those codes could be used to neutralize Willowshire's last line of defense and leave the entire royal family vulnerable to assassination or capture. Alexander realized that his brother hadn't just committed treason. He had been recruited for what amounted to a long-term plan to completely destroy Willowshire's ability to protect itself. The scope of Astoria's ambition was breathtaking in its audacity and terrifying in its implications. "Did you give them the codes?" Alexander asked, though he dreaded the answer. "No," Marcus said firmly, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Alexander felt a flicker of hope. "That's when I realized what they really wanted. That's when I understood that I wasn't helping maintain regional stability. I was helping them plan to destroy us." The rain continued to fall around them, washing away the last traces of the world Alexander had known that morning. In the space of 20 minutes, everything had changed. His brother was a traitor, their oldest ally had revealed itself to be their greatest enemy, and Alexander was faced with a choice that would define not only his reign as king, but the fate of everyone he loved. Commander Rhodes was watching him carefully, waiting for orders that would determine the future of the kingdom. Marcus was looking at him with desperate hope, pleading silently for forgiveness and protection that Alexander wasn't sure he could provide. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the rain and the palace walls, an entire kingdom continued their lives in blissful ignorance of the crisis that threatened to destroy everything they held dear. Alexander had always known that being king would require difficult decisions, but he had never imagined that his first truly royal choice would involve deciding whether to save his brother or save his kingdom. The silence in the courtyard stretched between the three men like a chasm that no bridge could span. Alexander stared into the trunk of his brother's car, seeing not just the evidence of betrayal, but the shattered remains of everything he had believed about family, loyalty, and the weight of royal blood. The rain continued its relentless assault, each drop feeling like a hammer blow against his resolve. Commander Rhodes shifted uncomfortably, his hand hovering near his radio with the weight of duty pressing down on him like a physical force. 23 years of faithful service had taught him that loyalty to the crown sometimes meant making choices that broke the heart, but his weathered face showed the toll this moment was taking on him. He had watched Prince Marcus grow from a precocious child into a troubled young man, but he had never imagined that protection would require him to potentially destroy the prince he had sworn to guard. "Your Highness," Rhodes said carefully, his voice cutting through the sound of rain on cobblestones. "We need to secure this evidence and begin damage assessment protocols immediately. Every minute we delay gives Astoria more time to act on whatever information they've already received." Alexander nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom in Rhodes's words while simultaneously feeling the crushing weight of their implications. Once the security apparatus of the kingdom began moving, there would be no stopping it. Investigations would be launched, interrogations would begin, and the full scope of Marcus's betrayal would be laid bare for examination by intelligence analysts, government ministers, and, eventually, the public. "What happens to him?" Alexander asked, gesturing toward Marcus without looking at his brother directly. The question hung in the air like an executioner's blade, sharp and final. Rhodes's expression hardened into the mask of professional duty that had served him through decades of protecting the royal family from threats both external and internal. "Treason carries a mandatory life sentence, Your Highness. Given the scope of the intelligence shared and the potential threat to national security, the courts would likely impose the maximum penalty." The maximum penalty. Alexander didn't need Rhodes to spell out what that meant. Willowshire had not executed anyone for treason in over a century, but the laws remained on the books, and Marcus's crimes were exactly the sort that those ancient statutes had been written to address. The thought of his brother facing a tribunal, spending the rest of his life in prison, or worse, made Alexander's stomach churn with a mixture of grief and rage that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained royal composure. Marcus seemed to shrink further into himself at Rhodes's words, as if the reality of his situation was finally penetrating the fog of denial and desperation that had sustained him through the confrontation. "Alex," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the rain. "I never meant for it to go this far. You have to believe me." Alexander finally turned to look at his brother directly, seeing not the polished prince who graced magazine covers and charmed diplomats, but a broken man who had made a series of catastrophic choices that had led them all to this moment. The face looking back at him was the same one that had shared childhood adventures, adolescent secrets, and adult responsibilities, but It was also the face of someone who had betrayed everything their family stood for. What you meant doesn't matter anymore, Alexander said, his voice carrying the cold authority that came with accepting the weight of the crown. What matters is what you did, what information you compromised, and what we do next. The transformation in Alexander's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. Rhodes recognized it immediately, having seen it in the prince's father and grandfather before him. The moment when personal feelings became subordinate to royal duty, when the man disappeared behind the crown he wore. It was a necessary evolution for any monarch, but seeing it happen in real time was both impressive and deeply unsettling. The evidence suggests a sophisticated intelligence operation spanning several years, Rhodes continued, his professional assessment cutting through the family drama with clinical precision. We'll need to assume that anything Prince Marcus had access to has been compromised. That includes state dinner guest lists, military exercise schedules, trade negotiation details, and potentially sensitive personal information about foreign dignitaries who have visited the palace. Alexander felt the scope of the crisis expanding with each word Rhodes spoke. It wasn't just about Marcus's betrayal. It was about the systematic compromise of Willowshire's diplomatic and security infrastructure. Every state function Marcus had attended, every briefing he had received, every casual conversation he had overheard in the palace corridors represented a potential intelligence victory for Astoria. We'll need to conduct a comprehensive review of all diplomatic communications from the past 3 years, Alexander said, his mind already shifting into crisis management mode. Alert our allies, review our military positioning, and assess the potential economic impact if our trade negotiations have been compromised. Rhodes nodded approvingly, recognizing the strategic thinking that would be essential for navigating the crisis ahead. I'll also need to expand the investigation to identify any other potential assets Astoria might have cultivated. This level of operation suggests significant resources and long-term planning. The implications hit Alexander like a physical blow. If Marcus had been recruited as part of a larger intelligence operation, it meant that Astoria had been planning to destabilize Willowshire for years. It meant that their oldest ally had been systematically preparing for what could only be described as a hostile takeover, using Marcus as their key to unlocking the kingdom's most sensitive secrets. They played me perfectly, Marcus said suddenly, his voice filled with bitter self-recognition. They appealed to my ego, convinced me I was contributing to regional stability, made me feel important and useful in a way that royal protocol never did. They understood exactly how to manipulate someone who felt like a spare heir with no real purpose. Alexander wanted to comfort his brother, to tell him that his purpose had always been clear and valued, but the truth was more complicated. Marcus had indeed struggled with his role as the younger son, always living in the shadow of Alexander's destiny, while carving out his own identity in increasingly reckless ways. The Astorian Intelligence Service had identified that vulnerability and exploited it with surgical precision. The charity work, Alexander realized suddenly. Your various philanthropic activities, the travel, the social connections. They weren't just cover for your meetings with handlers. They were intelligence-gathering opportunities. Marcus nodded miserably. They coached me on what to look for, what questions to ask, how to steer conversations toward useful topics. Every charity gala, every cultural exchange, every diplomatic reception became an opportunity to gather information that seemed innocent, but was actually part of a larger intelligence picture. The rain began to ease slightly, but the atmosphere in the courtyard only grew heavier as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. Alexander realized that he wasn't just dealing with his brother's personal failings. He was facing evidence of a coordinated attack on Willowshire's sovereignty that had been years in the making. Commander Rhodes checked his watch, a subtle reminder that time was working against them. Your Highness, I understand the personal difficulties involved, but we need to make decisions about immediate security measures. If Astoria realizes that Prince Marcus's operation has been discovered, they may accelerate whatever plans they have in motion. The weight of command settled on Alexander's shoulders like a mantle of lead. Every choice he made in the next few hours would ripple outward, affecting not only his family, but potentially millions of subjects who trusted the royal family to protect them from exactly this sort of threat. The crown that he would someday inherit carried with it the responsibility for their safety, their prosperity, and their future. We proceed by the book, Alexander said finally, the words feeling like they were being torn from his soul. Secure the evidence, begin the investigation, and assess the full scope of the compromise. But we do it quietly, at least until we understand what we're dealing with. Rhodes looked surprised by the qualification at the end of Alexander's statement. Your Highness, delaying official proceedings could be seen as protecting the kingdom's interests while we determine the best course of action, Alexander interrupted. Marcus will submit to interrogation and provide full cooperation in identifying the extent of the intelligence breach. But we do this carefully, Rhodes. The stability of the entire region could depend on how we handle the next 72 hours. Marcus looked up at his brother with something that might have been gratitude, though Alexander couldn't tell if it was for the temporary reprieve or for being treated like a prince rather than a traitor. The distinction might not matter in the end, but, for now, it was the only mercy Alexander could offer. As the three men stood in the fading rain, each lost in contemplation of the crisis that would define their futures, none of them noticed the figure watching from an upper window of the palace. Queen Isabella had been observing the scene in the courtyard with growing dread, and she alone understood the terrible irony of their situation. The secret that Marcus had carried was devastating, but it was not the only secret that threatened to destroy the royal family. What the queen knew, what she had hidden for 28 years, would make Marcus's treason look like a minor scandal by comparison. And she was about to discover that her carefully guarded secret was inextricably linked to the crisis now unfolding in the rain-soaked courtyard below. Queen Isabella stood at the tall window of her private study, watching the scene unfold in the courtyard below with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 4 decades navigating the treacherous waters of royal politics. The rain streaked down the glass like tears, distorting her view but not obscuring the gravity of the situation that was about to reshape the kingdom she had served faithfully since her marriage to the late King Robert. What her sons didn't know, what Commander Rhodes couldn't possibly suspect, was that the crisis currently destroying their family had roots that stretched back nearly 3 decades to decisions Isabella had made as a young queen desperate to protect her kingdom and secure her children's future. The irony was so bitter it left a metallic taste in her mouth. Marcus's betrayal was about to expose the very secret Isabella had been willing to commit treason herself to protect. A soft knock at her study door interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," she called, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of command, even as her heart hammered against her ribs with the force of impending catastrophe. Lord Chancellor Harrison stepped into the room, his usually impeccable appearance disheveled by the late hour and the urgent nature of his summons. As the kingdom's chief legal advisor and Isabella's most trusted confidant, Harrison was one of only 3 people alive who knew the truth about the choices Isabella had made to protect her family. Looking at his grim expression, Isabella realized that their carefully guarded secret was about to collide with Marcus's crisis in ways that could destroy everything they had built. "Your Majesty," Harrison said formally, though his voice carried the weight of their shared knowledge. "I've received word from our intelligence contacts in Astoria. The situation is far more serious than we initially believed." Isabella gestured for him to continue, though she dreaded what he might reveal. The intelligence network that had been built during the early years of her marriage was designed to protect Willow's Hire from exactly the sort of threat that Marcus had unknowingly become part of. The bitter irony was that the same network that had once saved her family was now about to expose the secret that could destroy them. The Astorian operation wasn't just about gathering intelligence, Harrison continued, his words measured and careful. They've been systematically mapping our security infrastructure, identifying vulnerabilities in our governmental systems, and, most troubling of all, they've been investigating the legitimacy of the royal bloodline. The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. The legitimacy of the royal bloodline. After 28 years of careful secrecy, meticulous planning, and constant vigilance, the one thing she had sworn to protect above all else was now under investigation by foreign intelligence agents who had used her younger son as their unwitting weapon. Isabella moved away from the window, her regal composure masking the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. "How much do they know?" Harrison consulted the encrypted document in his hands, his face grave. "They've been investigating irregularities in the royal medical records from the period around Prince Alexander's birth. They've also been examining historical documents related to the succession laws and questioning servants who worked in the palace during the relevant time period." The room seemed to spin around Isabella as the full implications became clear. The secret she had guarded so carefully, the choice she had made to save her marriage and secure her kingdom's future, was now being weaponized by Astoria as part of a larger plan to destabilize Willow's Hire. Marcus's betrayal had given them access to the palace, to sensitive information, and to the kind of detailed intelligence that could unravel decades of careful deception. Alexander, Isabella whispered, and the name carried all the weight of a mother's love and a queen's desperate choices. Harrison nodded gravely. If Astoria can prove what they suspect, it would invalidate Prince Alexander's claim to the throne and create a constitutional crisis that could dissolve the monarchy entirely. With Prince Marcus compromised by treason charges, there would be no clear succession, no legitimate heir, and no stable government to maintain order. Isabella sank into the leather chair behind her desk, feeling the weight of her crown like a physical burden that threatened to crush her. 28 years ago, when she had made the choice to protect her family and her kingdom, she had believed that the secret would die with her. She had never imagined that it would become a weapon in the hands of enemies who sought to destroy everything she loved. The truth was both simple and devastating. Prince Alexander was not King Robert's biological son. During the early years of her marriage, when the kingdom was facing economic crisis and political instability, Isabella had been unable to conceive the heir that was desperately needed to secure the succession. In desperation, and with the knowledge and consent of King Robert, she had turned to a trusted friend, a man whose discretion was absolute and whose love for the royal family was beyond question. The man who had fathered Alexander was Lord Commander Edmund Thorne, the kingdom's greatest military hero, and a man whose loyalty to the crown had been proven in battle against Astoria during the border wars. Thorne had died in service to Willowshire when Alexander was barely 2 years old, taking the secret to his grave and ensuring that the young prince would never know the truth about his parentage. What made the situation even more complex was that Thorne's sacrifice had not been in vain. Alexander had grown into exactly the kind of king Willowshire needed: intelligent, principled, and genuinely committed to the welfare of his subjects. His bloodline might not be royal in the traditional sense, but his character and capabilities were everything the crown required. "There's more, Your Majesty," Harrison said quietly, and Isabella realized that the crisis had depths she hadn't yet fathomed. Commander Rhodes has discovered evidence suggesting that Astoria's interest in Prince Marcus began shortly after they identified the irregularities in the royal succession. They didn't recruit him randomly or opportunistically. They targeted him specifically because they needed access to information that would confirm their suspicions about Prince Alexander's legitimacy. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with sickening clarity. Marcus hadn't been seduced into treason by appeals to his ego or his desire for purpose. He had been deliberately targeted, manipulated, and used as a weapon against his own family. Astoria had spent years building a case against Alexander's right to rule, and they had used Marcus as their key to gathering the evidence they needed to support their accusations. Isabella realized that every state dinner Marcus had attended, every briefing he had received, every casual conversation he had overheard in the palace corridors had been part of Astoria's systematic investigation into the royal family's most closely guarded secret. They hadn't just been gathering intelligence about Willowshire's military capabilities or economic negotiations. They had been building a legal and political case that could destroy the monarchy entirely. "What are our options?" Isabella asked, though she feared the answer. Harrison's expression was grim. "Limited, Your Majesty. If we proceed with treason charges against Prince Marcus, the investigation will inevitably uncover the intelligence he provided to Astoria, including whatever evidence they've gathered about Prince Alexander's parentage. If we attempt to suppress the investigation, we risk Astoria releasing their evidence independently, which would be even more damaging." Isabella understood the impossible position they now faced. Protecting Marcus from the consequences of his treason meant protecting the secret that Astoria had used him to investigate. But protecting the secret meant allowing foreign agents to escape accountability for a devastating intelligence operation that had compromised the kingdom's security. "There's one other factor to consider," Harrison added carefully. "Lord Commander Thorne's military records were sealed after his death, but they're not destroyed. If Astoria has been thorough in their investigation, they may have found ways to access those records or identify other evidence of his relationship with the royal family." The mention of Thorne's name brought back a flood of memories that Isabella had spent decades trying to forget. Edmund Thorne had been more than just Alexander's biological father. He had been the love of Isabella's life, a man whose honor and courage had inspired her during the darkest period of her marriage. Their brief relationship had been born of desperation and duty rather than passion, but it had given the kingdom the heir it needed and Isabella the child she had longed for. Now, Nearly 3 decades later, that choice was about to destroy everything they had all sacrificed to protect. A commotion in the courtyard below drew Isabella's attention back to the window. She could see Alexander gesturing animatedly while Commander Rhodes spoke into his radio. Marcus had collapsed against the side of his car, looking like a man who had finally grasped the full scope of the disaster he had created. They don't know, Isabella realized aloud. Alexander and Marcus have no idea that this goes beyond simple treason. Harrison nodded. For now. But once the investigation begins in earnest, it's only a matter of time before the connections become clear. Prince Alexander will discover that his brother's betrayal was specifically designed to expose the secret of his own parentage, and Prince Marcus will realize that he was manipulated into destroying his family in ways he never intended. Isabella felt the weight of 28 years of careful deception pressing down on her. Every choice she had made, every lie she had told, every moment of terror when she thought the truth might be discovered, had all been leading to this moment when the past finally caught up with the present. The queen who had spent decades protecting her family was about to discover that some secrets were too dangerous to keep, but too devastating to reveal. The choice she now faced would determine not only the fate of her sons, but the survival of the monarchy itself. And time was running out to find a solution that could save them all. The emergency meeting convened in the palace's most secure conference room as dawn broke over Willow's Hire, painting the sky in shades of gray that matched the somber mood within the ancient walls. Alexander sat at the head of the polished mahogany table that had witnessed centuries of royal decisions, but none quite like the one that now threatened to tear apart everything his family had built. Commander Rhodes had spent the night conducting a preliminary assessment of the intelligence breach, and his findings were even more devastating than anyone had imagined. Spread across the table were documents, photographs, and digital evidence that painted a picture of betrayal so comprehensive that it left the small group of advisors stunned into silence. The scope of the operation is unprecedented, Rhodes reported, his voice carrying the weight of a career spent protecting the royal family from threats he was trained to recognize and combat. Astoria has been systematically mapping our entire governmental structure, identifying every vulnerability, every personal weakness, and every potential avenue of attack. Queen Isabella sat to Alexander's right, her composure perfect despite the terror that had kept her awake through the long night. Lord Chancellor Harrison occupied the chair beside her, his usually pristine appearance showing signs of the stress that had consumed him since discovering the true nature of Astoria's investigation. Prince Marcus was notably absent from the meeting, confined to his quarters under guard, while the full scope of his cooperation with enemy agents was assessed. Alexander studied the evidence before him with the methodical attention to detail that had characterized his preparation for the throne. What he saw was a masterpiece of intelligence gathering that had turned his brother into an unwitting weapon against everything their family represented. Every social function Marcus had attended, every charitable cause he had championed, every cultural exchange he had participated in had been carefully orchestrated to provide Astoria with access to sensitive information. They weren't just gathering intelligence about our military capabilities or trade negotiations, Alexander said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. They were building a comprehensive profile of our family, our relationships, our vulnerabilities, and our secrets. Rhodes nodded grimly. The evidence suggests they've been investigating irregularities in the royal succession, questioning the legitimacy of the bloodline, and gathering information that could be used to challenge the very foundation of the monarchy. The words hung in the air like an executioner's blade, and Alexander felt something cold settle in his chest as he began to understand the true scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just about Marcus's betrayal or even about Astoria's intelligence operation. This was about the systematic destruction of Willowshire's governmental stability through the exposure of secrets that could invalidate the royal family's right to rule. Isabella knew that the moment of truth had arrived. 28 years of carefully guarded secrets were about to collide with the harsh reality of her son's crisis, and there was no path forward that didn't involve devastating consequences for everyone she loved. The choice she had made as a young queen to protect her family and kingdom was about to become the weapon that destroyed them both. Alexander, she said quietly, and something in her tone made everyone in the room turn to look at her. There's something you need to know. Something that Marcus's betrayal has made it impossible to hide any longer. Lord Chancellor Harrison closed his eyes, recognizing the moment he had dreaded for nearly 3 decades. The secret they had protected with such careful attention was about to be revealed, and there was no way to predict or control the consequences that would follow. Alexander studied his mother's face, seeing something there that made his pulse quicken with dread. What kind of secret? Isabella rose from her chair and moved to the window overlooking the courtyard where the previous night's confrontation had taken place. The morning light revealed the beauty of the palace grounds, the manicured gardens, and ancient stonework that represented centuries of royal tradition. It also revealed the fragility of institutions that could be destroyed by the revelation of truths that challenged their very foundation. The irregularities that Astoria has been investigating, Isabella said slowly, each word feeling like a stone dropped into still water. They're not irregularities. They're evidence of choices I made 28 years ago to protect this kingdom and secure the succession when traditional methods had failed. Alexander felt the world shift beneath him, as if the very ground he stood on had become unreliable. What choices? Isabella turned back to face her son, seeing in his expression the same intelligence and nobility that had characterized his father, both his legal father, King Robert, and his biological father, Lord Commander Edmund Thorne. The irony was heartbreaking. Alexander possessed the best qualities of both men, but the truth of his parentage was about to become a weapon in the hands of enemies who sought to destroy him. You are not King Robert's biological son, Isabella said, and the words seemed to echo in the conference room like thunderclaps. When I was unable to conceive the heir the kingdom desperately needed, when political instability threatened to destroy everything we held dear, I turned to a man whose honor and discretion were absolute. Lord Commander Edmund Thorne, who died in service to this kingdom when you were barely 2 years old, was your biological father. The silence that followed was so complete that Alexander could hear his own heartbeat drumming in his ears. Everything he had believed about himself, his family, his destiny, and his right to the throne had been shattered in a single sentence. The crown he had spent his entire life preparing to inherit was built on a foundation of deception that had now been exposed by his brother's betrayal. Commander Rhodes was the first to find his voice. Your Majesty, if this information has been compromised. It has been, Harrison said quietly, consulting the intelligence reports that had arrived throughout the night. Astoria's investigation has been comprehensive and thorough. They've examined medical records, questioned former palace staff, and analyzed documents that we believed had been destroyed decades ago. They have enough evidence to challenge Prince Alexander's legitimacy in international court. Alexander struggled to process the implications of what he had just learned. Not only was he facing the betrayal of his brother and the systematic infiltration of their government by foreign agents, but he was also confronting the revelation that his entire identity was based on a lie that was about to become public knowledge. Why? He asked, and the single word carried all the pain and confusion of a man whose world had been turned upside down. Isabella moved back to her chair, her regal bearing intact despite the devastation she had just inflicted on her son. Because the kingdom needed an heir, because your father, King Robert, was unable to conceive children, and because the political situation demanded stability that only a clear succession could provide. The choice wasn't made lightly, Alexander, and it wasn't made selfishly. It was made to save Willowshire from the chaos that would have followed if the royal line had ended with Robert. The revelation reframed everything Alexander thought he understood about his family's history. His father's distant relationship with him, his mother's fierce protectiveness, the way palace staff had always treated him with a particular combination of respect and something that might have been pity. The signs had been there, but he had been too trusting, too secure in his identity, to recognize them. Does Marcus know? Alexander asked. No, Isabella said firmly. Marcus was conceived naturally several years later, when medical treatments finally allowed me to have children with King Robert. He is Robert's biological son and heir, while you are a bastard, Alexander finished, the word feeling like acid in his mouth. You are the son of a hero, Isabella corrected fiercely. Edmund Thorne was the bravest, most honorable man I ever knew. His sacrifice in the border wars saved thousands of lives, and his discretion about your parentage protected the stability of this kingdom for nearly 3 decades. Alexander realized that the crisis they faced was even more complex than he had imagined. Marcus's treason had exposed the secret of Alexander's parentage, but that revelation also meant that Marcus, despite his betrayal, might actually be the legitimate heir to the throne. The brother who had sold state secrets to foreign agents was potentially the only person who could legally wear the crown of Willow's hire. Commander Rhodes consulted his notes with the methodical approach of a man trying to find solutions in an impossible situation. If Astoria releases this information publicly, it will create a constitutional crisis unlike anything in our history. The legitimacy of every decision Prince Alexander has made in preparation for the throne will be questioned. International allies will be forced to reconsider their relationships with Willow's hire, and domestic political stability will be threatened. There's more, Harrison added reluctantly. If Prince Alexander's claim to the throne is invalidated, and Prince Marcus is charged with treason, there would be no clear heir to the succession. The monarchy itself could be dissolved, and Willow's hire could face governmental collapse. Alexander understood that they were looking at the complete destruction of everything their family had built over 3 centuries. Astoria hadn't just been gathering intelligence. They had been systematically planning the annihilation of Willowshire's governmental structure through the exposure of secrets that would delegitimize the royal family's right to rule. The morning sun climbed higher outside the conference room windows, but the atmosphere inside remained dark with the weight of impossible choices. Alexander realized that he was facing a decision that would define not only his own future, but the fate of millions of subjects who depended on the stability his family provided. He could try to suppress the truth about his parentage, but that would mean allowing his brother's treason to go unpunished and potentially exposing the kingdom to future attacks. He could reveal everything publicly and face the constitutional crisis that would follow, potentially destroying the monarchy to preserve his integrity. Or he could find a third option that none of them had yet considered, a solution that might save both his family and his kingdom. As Alexander looked around the table at the faces of people who had devoted their lives to serving the crown, he realized that the choice he made in the next few hours would determine whether 3 centuries of royal tradition survived or whether he would be remembered as the prince who brought down a kingdom to save his brother. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier, even though he might never have the right to wear it. Epilogue. The choice of kings. 6 months later, the kingdom of Willow's hire stood at a crossroads that no one could have predicted when the rain fell on that fateful night in the palace courtyard. Alexander stood in the same conference room where the truth had been revealed, but the man looking out at the autumn landscape was fundamentally different from the prince who had entered that room believing in the certainty of his destiny. The solution he had chosen was unprecedented in Willowshire's history, requiring constitutional amendments, international negotiations, and a level of transparency that shocked both allies and enemies. Rather than hide the truth or accept the destruction of the monarchy, Alexander had proposed something revolutionary. The public acknowledgement of his parentage, combined with a new form of constitutional monarchy that derived its legitimacy from the consent of the governed rather than the accident of royal blood. The transition had been turbulent, requiring months of parliamentary debate, constitutional conventions, and public discourse about the nature of leadership and legitimacy. But, in the end, the people of Willow's hire had chosen to retain Alexander as their future king, not because of his bloodline, but because of his character and his commitment to transparent governance. Marcus had accepted responsibility for his actions, providing full cooperation in dismantling Astoria's intelligence network and working to repair the damage his betrayal had caused. His punishment had been exile rather than imprisonment, a mercy that reflected both Alexander's love for his brother and the kingdom's need to move forward rather than remain trapped in cycles of retribution. Queen Isabella had abdicated her position as regent, choosing to spend her remaining years in quiet service to charitable causes rather than continue to bear the weight of the crown she had protected through decades of secrecy. Her sacrifice had been publicly acknowledged, and history would remember her as a queen who had made impossible choices to protect her kingdom, even when those choices ultimately threatened to destroy it. As Alexander prepared for his coronation under the new constitutional framework, he reflected on the lessons learned during the crisis that had reshaped his understanding of leadership, family, and the true source of royal authority. The crown he would soon wear would be different from the one his ancestors had inherited, but it would be built on a foundation of truth and public trust that could withstand the challenges of a changing world. The kingdom of Willow's hire had survived its greatest constitutional crisis not by hiding from the truth, but by embracing it and using it as the foundation for a stronger, more honest form of governance. And Alexander, the prince who had discovered that his greatest weakness could become his greatest strength, was ready to lead his people into a future defined not by the accidents of birth, but by the choices they made together. The rain had washed away more than just the illusions of a single night. It had cleared the way for a new kind of kingdom, one where the crown was earned rather than inherited, and where the truth, no matter how painful, was always the foundation upon which justice was built. The Yindi. This is a work of complete fiction. All characters, kingdoms, and events are products of imagination and bear no relation to any real persons, living or dead, or actual historical events.